So, I think I found a fatal flaw in the New Testament.
Really, you actually read the New Testament?
Well, not exactly. I read about it online. I like websites written by skeptics. They go through and pick out lists of dozens of troubling Bible verses.
I see.
Anyways, I read that Jesus predicted he would come back within one generation, and he didn't, so that means he was not sent here by God.
I think I know which part you mean.
Mark 13, verse 30. Jesus is talking about the end of the world. Then he says, "Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened."
Yes, that part is called the Olivet Discourse. It's a collection of predictions made by Jesus.
Right, and one of them is, "People will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory."
What do you think that means?
Well, it sounds like the end of the world that Christians are always getting ready for.
Maybe, maybe not. You have to look at the context. For example, back in verse 1 and 2 of the same chapter, Jesus talks about the temple being destroyed.
Which temple?
The second Jewish temple in Jerusalem, built in the 6th century BC, and renovated by King Herod about 50 years before the time of Jesus.
So what are you saying?
Well, the entire chapter could be taken to refer to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, when the Romans put down a Jewish revolt. The events surrounding it must have been traumatic for the people of Judea. In some ways, it was like the end of that world, and the coming of a new kingdom of God. Of course, if this is what the chapter is about, then the comment about this generation is pretty accurate. Evidence for, rather than against, Jesus being God's son.
I don't think it's about that. The language is too detailed and it sounds more like a literal return of Jesus to gather his chosen ones.
Well, you might be right. If it is about the end of the world, then we have to deal with that word generation.
Indeed.
There are two possible solutions. First, the word translated as generation could be taken to mean either a race of people or another kind of group, like all of Christ's followers. It is not entirely clear, and if one letter were copied wrong it would take on a different meaning.
But generation is the most likely translation?
Yes, it is. The second, and more likely, possible explanation is that the words, this generation, refers to the generation seeing the signs that the end is near. Darkening of the sun and moon, false messiahs, and so on. The generation that sees these things is the one Jesus says will see the end. He's not talking about the one hearing the initial prediction.
I don't know. The whole chapter sounds pretty jumbled. It's not clear which part is about the temple and what the other things are supposed to be.
I agree, it is a difficult chapter. It also predicts persecution of Christians, which could refer to 70 AD or many other times and places. Some people think this chapter is like a shortened description of the whole history of the church.
On the one hand it sounds too vague to test, sort of like Nostradamus. On the other hand I still think that choice of words, this generation, is important. I realize I can't have it both ways.
Well, so far our discussion has assumed that Mark 13 is a verbatim quotation. Keep in mind that Mark's Gospel was written perhaps 30 or 40 years after the death of Jesus.
That's a long time. Why should we believe anyone would have a memory that long?
It's actually not a long time, as ancient documents go. Much of what we know about Alexander the Great or Buddha comes from books written hundreds of years later. Even most of what we know of some Roman emperors comes from sources written decades later. In some ways, the New Testament is one of the more reliable ancient texts.
Still, 30 to 40 years is a long time.
Yes, but it's likely that there were intermediate written sources now lost to us. And we also have Paul's letters, which predate Mark, and give us an earlier glimpse at the church.
Still, even if Jesus was the Son of God, why should we be confident that Mark got everything right, word for word?
That's my point of view too. Mark is reconstructing the life and teachings of Jesus for his readers. Given his reverence for the subject, I think he's being honest. But it's possible that in combining eyewitness accounts, hearsay, earlier texts, and so on, that he made some mistakes. Especially for the most, as you say, jumbled parts. So we shouldn't get hung up on any one specific word, such as generation. It's more important to read the entire New Testament and reconstruct the best picture we can of what was said and done.
I think you're letting the writers off too easy. I mean, if there are any errors in the Bible, we can't trust any of it, right?
No, I think that's an unreasonable standard. Granted, many Christians of the more fundamentalist variety claim the entire Bible as being correct word for word. I can't blame you for playing along. It makes it easier to reject it. But not all Christians think that way.
Why don't you think it's a reasonable standard?
Well, first of all, the Bible is multiple books, not just one.
Okay, then, consider any one book, like Mark's Gospel. If he's wrong about some of the details, the entire story is likely to be wrong. It just shows sloppy research.
Not necessarily. If the story were too neat and perfect, people would also call it a fake. True stories often miss the details, especially when the author is trying to arrange all of the information to present a powerful story.
That's another problem. The Gospels are too dramatic. They sound more like fiction than journalism.
Well, there is a third category you are overlooking, the one we call based on a true story. For example, have you seen the movie Schindler's List?
Sure. German businessman with ties to the Nazis saves Jews from being sent to the concentration camps.
Right. It's clearly not claiming to be fiction. The director makes it quite clear that it is about a real person who really did save many lives. Now, of course you can read about the Holocaust in many sources, but suppose you could not, and all you had to go on was Schindler's List and a few other films like it.
Well, I would consider many other factors, like what the story says, and any other history I could find about the period.
Of course. Now suppose that, based on this assessment, you decide that Schindler's List is most likely based on a true story.
Okay.
Now, suppose someone points you to imdb.com, which has a page about the movie. And in it, you find a list of dozens of errors found by careful viewers. For example, the design of the Nazi badge that Schindler has is different from what you find in actual Nazi sources. Also, there's a scene where Schindler is doing a job interview and there is furniture in the room at first, but a few frames later the furniture is gone.
Well, that wouldn't be a big deal. I mean, directors make mistakes.
Exactly. What would you think if someone found these mistakes and concluded that the story is a fake? Or even that the Holocaust itself didn't happen?
Well, if, like you said, I had other grounds for believing the story to be true, it would be unreasonable to reject that, because of some minor inconsistencies. Or to assume that everything said by Schindler in the film was a verbatim quote of what Schindler said in real life.
Right. That's how I think one should look at the Gospels. The resurrection is presented as a fact by all the Gospels, and the main parables were easy to remember, so most of them are probably quite close to how Jesus told them. But the more obscure passages, where the order is not clear or the translation is difficult, should not be used to convincingly prove a point, whether that point is for or against whatever we hope to be true.
Okay, I get that. But what about the Old Testament?
That's different. Most of it was written down hundreds of years after the events it describes, so we have to read it quite differently. We'll discuss that in another video.
Fine. I still have one more problem though. There are other verses in the New Testament that show a sense of urgency about the end being near. Nothing as clear as Mark 13:30, but they all seem consistent with thinking that Jesus could be back at any moment. So where is he?
Well, consider a couple of things. First, in Mark 13:32, just 2 verses, after talking about the generation, Jesus says that no one knows the day or the hour of these events, not even him. Second, many other stories, like the parable starting at Luke 12:13, talk about how one's own death may come at any moment. That's the point being emphasized throughout the New Testament. Life is short. Whether through your own individual death or the return of Jesus, either way you are going to meet God sooner than you think.
Okay. Sounds like enough for today.